Welcome to the Actionable ESG Talks series brought to you by AKFI, the Actionable Knowledge Foundational Institute, the world's first nonprofit sustainability association committed to bridging the gap between ESG, sustainability, and digital transformation. Actionable ESG Talks series bring together great minds to discuss the current state and future state of ESG, sustainability, and digital transformation. I'm delighted to be here with our guest, our returning guest, I should say, Peter McAteer. It had been almost a year since we talked last, so we have a lot to talk about today. But before going there, Peter McAteer serves as the managing director of Sustain Learning LLC, a firm dedicated to developing more sustainable organizations. And that's a lot to say about that. His focus is on sustainability, sustainable strategy, business transformation, and talent development. Peter is also a member of the editorial board of the Anthem Press Environment and Sustainability Initiative. And the complete bio will be posted after this program. Peter, welcome. And let's start to talk about your very new and very important book. We have selected several themes for today's discussion, mostly focused on the book. Let's start with the traditional question. What inspired you to write Leading the Sustainable Organization, the quest for ethical brands and the culture of sustainable innovation?
Well, first of all, thank you. The book is the third in essentially a series. And in some ways, I've been mapping my what I'm writing to the requests I get from my clients around the world as they're evolving. So where my first book came out in 2019 on this topic, it really was a follow-on to how companies were responding to the Paris Accords 2015 and this great new push towards sustainability. It's hard maybe for some people to remember, but we didn't have this global definition of sustainability really before 2015. We had the Millennium Development Goals, but it didn't use the word sustainability as an overarching theme. It was in one of the 8 goals, sustainable energy and environment. So it's still a fairly recent phenomenon. So as things have evolved, and things are evolving quite quickly, I've gone from the idea of how do you get started to the idea of the second book, which was how do you accelerate things and worry more about ecosystems and barriers to growth. And in the third book, I'm simply acknowledging that for us to succeed, and right now we're behind in most goals. I think the latest SDG report says we're only on track for about 17% of the goals. And even though we haven't met the 10-year average, which is the definition for are we exceeding 1.5 degrees, we are exceeding it on individual years. So we're already breaking through thresholds. And so the book really basically says, if you're going to make a change, the people who are leaders in organizations today, who are responsible for the $110 trillion in global GDP, which is where we are today, they have to do something if we're going to meet the 2030 goals. And when I teach in universities, my target is slightly different. It's the same sort of topics, but it basically says a lot of you will eventually become the general managers who lead us from 2030 to 2050. And therefore, I want to make sure you get the right perspective. And that's why the tagline is so important to me. It's not just about leadership and sustainability. It's about this idea that ethics are at the core. And that has to be one of the guiding principles, because otherwise you can do a lot of things that make you some money today, but you really are not embracing the principles that say we have to behave differently. And what I like to tell students is we're going to add another $100 trillion in the next 25 years in global GDP. It's basically doubling. And the last 100 trillion took us 75 years. Now we're going to do it in 25. And we're going to add another 1.5 billion people. And while we do all that, and remember, 100 trillion is production and consumption. It's materials we're using, waste we're creating, emissions we're creating, things being transported all over planet Earth. We've got to do all this while we bring emissions down, while we address global poverty, and while we deal with the fact that the world is warming, because we've already built in a lot of energy into the climate system that we can't just take out tomorrow. It's there. And we are going to continue to create emissions. That's inevitable. Just how fast can we bring it down? So for all those reasons, you say, well, who gets to do it? Leaders get to do it. The people who are in charge of companies. And if you go around the world and you said, who produces 80% of the food? It's about 10 companies. If you say, who produces 80% of the oil? Well, it's about 10 companies who do it. If you really think about it, there's a fairly small number. And what I emphasize in the book is things like ESG are dictated by three markets: the US, European Union, and China. There's 198 signatories to the Paris Accords, but only, those three markets dictate everything. So I'm here talking to you in Thailand, and Thailand can pass whatever laws it wants. But if you want to sell something internationally, well, you've got to pay attention to what those markets are doing and what the customers are doing in those markets. And so that has to be the focus of your business. That's one of those things I call a boundary condition in the book that is changing the decision structure. So being ethical is your core. But at the end of the day, you've got to make a set of decisions as a business to respond to have all this market variability. And that is, I think people need some guidance, and the book is intended to be a bit of a blueprint.
Just to mention, what are the boundary conditions you mentioned in the book? And I may add one or two as a question to you.
Sure. Well, boundary conditions are the things that have always been, which surround the sets of decisions you make. So when you look at a senior executive, you say, well, a senior executive is going to make decisions on capital allocation, and they're going to make decisions about core processes in the business. They're going to make certain structural decisions, right, about business units, geographic units, functional units, et cetera. So they're going to have those set of decisions. And that's probably the same as it was 10, 15, 20 years ago. So the basic kind of ideas are the same. But the difference now is all of these boundary conditions, which in some ways, other new boundary conditions are going to be about things like artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and other things which change the environment for your business. So part of the challenge, particularly if you're an older individual and you went to school 30 years ago or longer, conditions were less variable. Right? We didn't have major changes in tariffs 30 years ago. We didn't have this major concern about sustainability until this century, so until the last 25 years. Back in the 80s and 90s, people were much more worried about changes in technology. But the changes in technology today dwarf the idea that I'm worried about moving from mainframes to mid-range computers, or I'm trying to figure out whether client server is still the basis of my organization and my customer service group, or are we going to move to this new internet thing? So all those felt like radical changes, but we've got that and more happening simultaneously. And things like artificial intelligence are going to greatly accelerate. So you go back to the same issues. I've got to worry about capital allocation. So a perfect example is now the boundary conditions include things like nationalism, the rise of nationalism. It includes the changes in tariff conditions. It changes in global partnerships. So I'm now trying to, for example, invest in battery plants to try to catch up in the United States to where the Chinese are. They're doing the same thing in Europe. But what do you have now? Now you have a government taking away incentives, and now you have an imbalance between all the new battery activity coming online and the sales, which are softening because of the changes in incentives. Well, you can't make these big investments on the basis of a 5-year decision timeline. These decisions will last you for 25 years, 30 years, et cetera. And in areas that you're well versed with on supply chains, the supply chains for a lot of business have developed over decades. And with that, you've aligned all your incentives, you've done all your legal work, all this structure, which may involve thousands of people. You can't just change it overnight. So the fact that you have new things to consider is relevant, but the speed with which they change and the stability greatly affects how leaders can make decisions and the risks that they have. So I try to get people to start thinking about these boundary conditions, because when they're not variable, you forget they're there. All right? It's not something I worry about. But now you say, hey, back in the 60s, portfolio management was a big deal. And the people at Boston Consulting Group thought this was the latest and greatest thing. But then we sort of got away from that. What's useful to remember is it was a great idea for a set of conditions. Now, as the conditions change, is it a good or a bad idea? Maybe going backwards, certain ideas is good. Maybe changing some of the things going forward. So part of the process is simply to say, what are the variables at play? And there's a lot of them. You still have to narrow down and ultimately make a decision about who am I going to hire? How am I going to structure my organization? What products and services am I going to offer? So all those things you still have to do. It's just, what's the relative influence for all these new conditions? And what is the universe of conditions that I have to worry about as a leader in business?
Two observations and maybe a question. One of them, you brought the time variable in the boundary conditions. Not all of them align on the same time, right? Especially process like long-term investments. You mentioned AI, building hyperscalers, right? And building fabs for manufacturing is in tens of years or 5 to 10 year time scale, where some decisions are on a short time scale, like risk avoidance. A storm or a flood brings the decision very close. And one model I'm using, and I will ask you where sustainability should fit on this model. Imagine in the CEO office, there are 10 items, 10 boundaries that he or she has to take care of. And how do you, or is it sustainability part of these boundaries? You mentioned the ethics. Yes, the ethics have to be there on a boundary condition. You have to be ethical. If not, your customers will tell you. You have to mitigate risks, right? We mentioned short-term risk, long-term risk, decisions where you build a fab, for instance. Do you build it in the middle of desert and or near to a flooded area? So talking about these 10 boundaries and imagining this list of 10 boundaries on the wall of the CEO of the executives that you mentioned and you so kindly training today, where sustainability should fit? Should it be on the list? And why not?
Well, a lot of this depends on, businesses are not all the same. So if part of this question says, I'm putting a list on the wall for the CEO of Johnson & Johnson, who has 280 subsidiaries, this is a very different question than if I am, let's say, BASF, also a very big company, but they really have three big markets. That's what drives their revenue, versus an automotive company, who in the US is largely committed to building trucks and SUVs. The kinds of things, or from agriculture business for different sort of things. So sustainability is high on the list, although for the most part, on the list is coaching. What I try in the book to do is separate what I'll call filters. I address this actually a bit more in my first book when I call them tests for success. Right? So I don't look at ethics as a boundary condition, because I don't see it as a choice. I think people, should have at their core a desire to do the right thing. And so what I tend to say to people is, you're looking for competitive differentiation, right? According to sustainable. principles do, whatever decision you would like to create, that product or service cannot be harmful to the communities where we live and work. Right? So do whatever you want, but let's not make it harmful. Do not create any social or environmental negatives in terms of what you're doing. And if possible, let's see if we can restore some of the things we've destroyed in the past. So let's say you have a power plant and you're in a nice southern state and offshore is a nice barrier reef. Is it possible to do this without destroying the barrier reef? That should be how we design things. So on the one hand, I'm saying to people, go find in whatever industry you are, whatever new products or service, however you wish to innovate, right? Chase whatever part of that new $100 trillion 95 years, right? All this new infrastructure that's going to need to be built. Do all that, right? But do it in a way where you find your competitive advantage, you do it without creating social and environmental negatives, and you try to restore some of what we've already destroyed. And at your core, try to do the right thing, which to me is your ethical framework, right? Just don't do it in a way that harms other people in order for you to get gain. Now, if we want to drill down in that a little bit, to me, you create a series of checklists that go through. And you say, listen, I'm in the automotive industry, and I got to make a decision to invest in hybrids or hybrid electrics or gasoline engines, or what do I do? You're not really changing the fact that you're in the transportation industry. That was decided, back when Henry Ford kicked off the company. So that's not really up for decision right now. And even if you wanted to, right, you still would have the challenge of how do I replace the whatever it is, 100 and I don't want to sell plastics anymore. So that's really great, except you've got 70 billion in revenue right now. That's all based on polymers. So I have to create a way. So to me, the choices you have on the wall are, how do I move my company in a direction, right? I'm trying to do good things. I'm trying to sell good products. And I'm trying to design my new products in ways that don't do damage, right? No social, environmental negatives, that help clean something up. But I still have to pursue those basic business issues of competitive advantage, I've got to find my niche in that industry. So in that sense, sustainability is a wrapper around which you do it. If you are an executive in a supplier to one of these big firms, right? You have maybe very little choice, because up on your list, let's say I'm a textile maker in Pakistan, right? Up on my list is, what is all these other companies want, because that's what I have to do. And so if Levi's tells me I can't be a supplier to them unless I can show them a 40% reduction in water use, all of a sudden, 40% reduction in water use is really high on my list, because that represents 25% of my revenue. So to me, that list, most people get very practical in terms of what they're doing. And since most companies have an existing set of products and services, I'm trying to help you. How do I take your existing products, make them better, more sustainable, while introducing a new set of products and services that are more sustainable by design? Both have to be profitable. Both have to have a pathway to have growth, pay good jobs, create revenue, support shareholders, do all those other sort of things. So to me, the challenge is not you get a blank slate. That's a startup company kind of concept. Most other companies have a transition that they've got to make. And sustainability is one of those overarching themes that affect my long-term plan and the trend. To be honest, similar to one of those other long-term trends is something like artificial intelligence. How fast, it's a hard one to figure out at times. But I do know it's important. And I know I have to do something and respond to it. But is it going to eliminate all the jobs in my company? I don't know. That seems a little bit radical at the moment, and I don't have to make that decision today. But I got to worry about it. And I have to worry about what my competitors are doing. And I've got to worry about where is public policy heading on this. And that, on my list, is one of those conditions that affects things. So I'll go back to the same example I used about any one of the automotive companies, but even like a company like BASF or any of these really big companies. You have different regulations now in the US and Europe. You have different opinions on the Global Plastics Treaty. So if I'm going to have if my original strategy said, I'm in Germany going to be manufacturing certain coatings and things for the world because that's where I have scale and I can do these things very efficiently. Now I have to say, well, wait a minute. I have different conditions in the United States. So do I put the plant in Europe or do I plant the plant in the US? And I really want to expand my Canadian market. What about all these tariffs now? Is this going to end with the Trump administration? And again, is that influence that I should put that plant? Again, I've been better off with several smaller plants that are more distributed. So all sorts of new issues come in. So to me, the list on the wall is a custom list that I do for every company. And you've got to take this big set of conditions and narrow it down that says, in the space you're trying to operate in, yes, generically it's sustainability, but that doesn't mean anything. It's like talking about, okay, should I worry about more hurricanes? Well, I mean, yeah, but if I'm in Manitoba, not really. It's not my problem. Or if I'm on upstate New York, that's not really my issue at Cornell is dealing with hurricanes, at least not often. So again, all these things have to be specific to the company, but the variability is the challenge, because you can think you've got it right, and it could look smart for 2 or 3 years.
Peter, the image you're putting in my mind is the paper we print, the 10 boundaries or the 10 items I have to take care every day and remind myself. The paper is the sustainability, is the wrapper. It's where we print this and always has to be in the background of every decision we make. This is the image you sort of projected in my mind. I don't know if it's correct or not. I'll turn back to you.
Well, if I were an executive and I'm trying to get everybody in my organization, I'm trying to create a culture of innovation, right? I'm saying to people, you can innovate away, be as creative as you want. But when you come to see me, I'm going to ask you, was there a more sustainable way to achieve the same end? Right? Have we created a product that is easier to disaggregate and therefore easier to recycle or remanufacture? Right? Is this something that can be repaired or not? I want to create a series of, now go knock yourself out. Right? Come up with anything you want, but don't bring me something that doesn't pass this basic test within which we have established our purpose and the basic guidelines, ethical guidelines, sustainable guidelines, the principles within which we choose to operate. And I want people to get up in the morning and be excited about the business they're in, to be excited that they're doing something, and not have to hang their head in shame that they're doing it and simultaneously destroying natural systems. Right? That shouldn't be what we feel bad about. And that to me is when I talk to clients and said, this is possible. You can do this. Right? And again, I think it's a core philosophy that guides things. So it's like, values. You don't put values on the board as a product or service. That's not what it is.
Yes.
And these sort of things are also the way that you encourage teams to work by getting different perspectives. It's the way that you introduce ways of doing decision making so that you don't, with your biases, aren't the only one to make all of my supply chain decisions. I've got to have a way of multiple people looking at these tests and offering their perspective, because maybe someone came up in supply chain from the supply side as opposed to the buy side. And they're going to have a different take on this. I want to hear that take, right? Sooner or later, someone has to make a decision, but I want all these perspectives to help refine my choices so that I feel like I'm making positive forward progress as a business that I can defend as the CEO, and that this is consistent with our purpose as a business.
So now we looked, and you mentioned actually, and I'll come back to this, the sustainability. We look at it vertically inside the company and what role culture plays, what role ethics play. Of course, they all come under the leadership umbrella and building the new generation or educating the new generation of leaders. But you also mentioned, like in the car and transportation industry, we studied at AKFI, for instance, the relationship between tire manufacturers and car manufacturers. And we find out that sustainability has to be also horizontal, not only vertical inside the business and on the 10 items we discuss on the list, but also horizontal, communicated. And you mentioned, for instance, that the suppliers have to follow the sustainability requirements of the customers normally. However, what we notice is these are divergent in the sense that every car manufacturer will have a different set of requirements, timelines, net zero. In the same time, the supplier has to meet divergent requirements, for instance, helping with scope 3 carbon footprint. Most of it comes from the supply chain. Ethical issues, stakeholders issues, child labors, different laws, as you mentioned. So everything,
Yeah.
when you look at the supply chain, we found out, and we are building now a framework, which we call it the STS, the Sustainability Transaction, because it's a transaction between these groups, standard. Any view on how the supply chain role also changes with sustainability? And I know you mentioned it in the book.
Yeah, the standards are really important because they are the natural evolution that allows, creates greater certainty in the business environment. So one of the challenges when I talk to people about sustainability, I say it's a low maturity knowledge domain because you have enormous amounts of variability. And one of the reasons back in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s that there were so many technology advisory firms out there was because the technology was changing every year. The software was changing every year. So you needed someone who could come in and say, oh, okay, here's the latest. And I can help tell you about that. But at the end of the day, that's not terribly helpful to a large business, which is trying to reduce its costs and improve its operations. So, we still have a lot of work to do on this. But part of the work is establishing standards where possible. So, you can see Europe is probably farther ahead in this. But the fact that they say, you need to have a value chain analysis, and a value chain analysis looks like this. You need to have a product carbon footprint, and a product carbon footprint means this. And so what we're seeing around the world is the change from unregulated phrases and language to regulated phrases and language. So you can say something like gaslighting. Well, whatever gaslighting means in a lot of places. But greenwashing in Australia, in Canada, in Europe, it means some very specific thing. There's a definition to it. And if you run afoul of that law, you will get fined. So there are certain ways that these things, now you could turn around and say woke washing or blue washing. Well, that means nothing. But a lot of this language still flows out there. So supply chains are going to have a challenge for quite a bit of time, particularly because of the current U.S. tariff changes and what that potentially means, and the reciprocal actions that are happening in China and the European Union. Again, those three markets define everything. So unfortunately, if you're a global business right now, you have to keep an idea on these three things. Now, simultaneous to that, you would have had anyway, with automation and artificial intelligence, an onshoring activity anyway, because the labor cost is being reduced greatly in a lot of areas. So if you go to Bangladesh, where I was a couple of years ago, and you look at these textile factories, you had automation lines, textile looms that would have employed 200 people 20 years ago, now employ 10. And then, of course, you ask the question, well, who makes the loom? Well, that's either made in China or Germany. And you say, okay, so I have reduced my labor cost by 90%, and I have to ship it halfway around the world. Wouldn't I be better just taking that equipment and putting it in Alabama in the United States, closer to my customer? And now I can turn a 4-month cycle, buying cycle, to a 30-day buying cycle.
Absolutely.
Are higher, they're now 90% cheaper, and they're trending in that direction. So all of these things have to work together, that sometimes the variability and the technology work together so that the standards, oh, I don't need a standard for 3 different countries. I only need a standard for one, because some of it already got solved. Where if I left it in the old model, it was not. The challenge for the supply chain people is that in a world where you used to worry about quality and cost, you now have all these other conditions that you have to worry about. And very often I find it's the incentives and things that you have versus the incentives that the legal department has versus the incentives that people in engineering have, et cetera, are not aligned to this new reality. And therefore you find a lot of resistance, not just in the market, but also just in your own organization. It's very, very difficult. But standards are key. And I think if most business leaders were honest, they would say, we'd be better off if the US and Europe and China would just play nice and create a global standard, for example, for electric vehicles, for the charging connectors, for what the battery standards would be, what the fire standards would be, what the thermal standards would be. If they would just do that, it would make it life easier for everybody. But I don't hold out hope that that will happen really fast. So I think people in supply chain got a lot of hard work ahead of them.